My name is Carol White. I'm 65 years old and I've buried two husbands in one lifetime. The first time I was younger, 48, with dark brown hair I still wore curled at the ends, a penchant for making Sunday pot roast, and two adult daughters who called every day, even when they had nothing to say. That first time, I was surrounded. My kitchen never emptied for a week. Friends from my book club brought casseroles. My daughters folded laundry. A neighbor I barely knew fixed a loose banister he claimed my husband always meant to repair. The grief was raw but somehow buffered. I was held, almost cradled, by the small kindnesses of familiarity. The second time, just 4 months ago, was different. It wasn't that people weren't kind. They were, some of them. But I was older, quieter. My life had closed in like a tide pulling away from the shore. At 65, people don't hover the same way. They assume you've been through worse and learn to stitch up your own wounds. They call once, maybe twice. They offer lukewarm condolences and move on. My second husband, Richard, was not the kind of man you think you'd marry twice in a lifetime. He was rigid in posture, but warm in spirit, quiet but perceptive. A civil engineer for nearly 40 years, he loved maps and coffee in equal measure. I met him in a town zoning meeting I attended by mistake. We sat through 2 hours of discussions on bike lanes and fire hydrants before walking out into the same drizzle. He made a joke about being trapped in bureaucratic purgatory, and I laughed too long, mostly because I hadn't laughed like that in months. It took nearly 2 years before we moved in together, 4 more before we married. It was never passionate the way movies promise, but it was solid. Not once in 17 years did I feel unsure of where I stood with him. He never raised his voice. He always made space for me, in the closet and in conversation. And most importantly, he made me feel seen. That part is critical because when someone like Richard sees you, quietly, consistently, you begin to notice all the places others never did. His son, Adam, never quite warmed to me. Polite, always polite, but his smiles felt like rehearsed lines, gestures of civility rather than connection. In the early years, he came around for dinners, birthdays, 4th of July barbecues in the backyard. But after our wedding, the visits thinned. There were always reasons: work, his own family, the kids' school events. Nothing overt, just distance, cold like a winter that arrives gradually, until one day you wake up and realize the pipes have frozen. Richard didn't press him. That wasn't his way. But I saw the quiet disappointment in the way he'd ask after Adam, with an air of resignation. I saw it when he'd stand too long in the card aisle near the Sun section, looking without picking one. When Richard was diagnosed, aggressive, inoperable, it felt like the earth had skipped a beat. He told me on a Wednesday morning. I remember because I had just pulled banana bread out of the oven. The house still smelled of cinnamon and brown sugar. He walked in from his doctor's appointment with his shoulders slightly slouched, and I knew something had shifted. He didn't make it dramatic, just said, "Pancreatic. It's bad." We didn't cry right then. Instead, we sat at the table, him with coffee, me with a slice of bread neither of us touched. We talked about what he wanted, not to drag it out, not to become someone else. Dignity, comfort, the same jazz music at bedtime, the same view of the garden through the bedroom window. Adam visited twice during the entire 3 months. Both times, he was restless. He paced the corners of the room. He asked questions like he was preparing for an insurance audit. What medications, what costs, what paperwork needed signing. He never asked how Richard felt, not once. After Richard passed, at home, holding my hand, a whisper of music playing low, I expected Adam might soften. Grief can do that. Strip us back to something tender. He came to the funeral late, sat stiffly, left early. He didn't meet my eyes. The day after the burial, I began going through Richard's things. Not to erase him, never that, but to honor what he loved, to touch what he touched, to be near the trace of him. His clothes still held his scent, a mix of cedarwood and laundry soap. His slippers were by the bed, where he'd always left them, his reading glasses on the side table. I gathered what I thought Adam might want. I didn't expect gratitude, but I didn't expect cruelty either. I packed a modest box, a dozen books from Richard's study, his favorites, the ones with folded corners and margin notes, his old army sweater, moth-eaten in one elbow, but still thick with memory, the watch he wore every day, a simple one with a cracked leather strap he never replaced because it still did the job. I drove the 35 minutes to Adam's house in Oak Hill. I'd called ahead, no answer. I texted, no reply. But I knew they were home. The car was in the driveway. When the door opened, it was Adam. He looked at me the way you look at someone who's selling something you don't want. I brought some of your father's things, I said. His eyes dropped to the box. He didn't even lean forward to take it. Just put it by the wall. We'll sort through it later. Same with what's left of you. And he shut the door. Just like that. No thank you. No glance. Not even a name. I stood there for a long moment, my arms still hovering where the box had been. I heard a laugh from somewhere deep in the house. His wife's, maybe. A dog barking. And then silence. I got in my car and sat with my hands still gripping the steering wheel, though the engine wasn't running. My chest didn't hurt. My eyes didn't blur. There was no scene, no dramatic sobs or shattered boxes. There was only the quiet realization that something irreversible had been made clear. Something Richard had always tried to buffer had revealed itself fully, plainly, without ceremony. I wasn't family to them. I never had been. And he was no longer a person, not to Adam. He was a category, an estate, an item on a checklist to be handled. The worst part wasn't even the insult. It was that I believed him. I believed Adam would handle what was left of me too, not out of malice, but indifference. That cold efficiency of someone raised with privilege, but without presence. Someone who thought love was a ledger. I drove home, slowly. Windows down though the air was cool. A part of me waited for my hands to shake, for grief to spill over, but it didn't. I parked the car, went inside, took off my shoes, poured a glass of water. I sat by the window where the afternoon sun threw soft shapes on the floor. The empty box still sat on the passenger seat, the same box I had filled with what I thought was love. I looked at it. I stared for a long time, and then something unfamiliar settled in my chest. Not rage, not sorrow. Something else. Clarity. A stillness sharp enough to cut. And for the first time in weeks, I whispered something aloud. My own voice startled me. What if we make sure there's nothing left? Not for them, but for him. For the man who used to trace his finger over maps while sipping his third cup of coffee. For the man who once brought me a snow globe from a gas station just because he thought it was so stupid it's sweet. For the man who laughed silently, shoulders shaking, eyes full. For the only man who ever really saw me. He deserved better than a corner memorial. He deserved to be remembered in motion, not encased in a shadow box. And well, I had just begun to remember who I was before they tried to erase me. The next morning, the sky looked bruised. Soft purple clouds dragging across the horizon like old regrets. I stood by the front door with a mug of coffee, watching the wind nudge the leaves on our front maple. Richard used to say, fall was the only honest season. Everything shows its age, and no one pretends otherwise. The box sat where I'd dropped it the night before, just inside the doorway, slightly crooked. The books leaned sideways, the corner of the old army sweater peeking out like a dog's ear from under a blanket. I hadn't touched it since returning from Adam's house. I hadn't even kicked off the dust. I picked it up now, not because I had a plan, but because I couldn't keep stepping around it. It was too full of absence. I set it on the dining table, next to the placemats we hadn't used since the diagnosis. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that folds in on itself. I pulled out a chair. Saturday took a sip, and I opened the box. At first, I only stared. The familiar chaos of a man's everyday life, distilled into a cardboard square. A pile of annotated books, dog-eared, yellowed, underlined in blue ink. The sweater with its elbow threadbare and its collar still holding the faint smell of cedar. The watch, scratched, the leather stiff, still ticking faintly. I touched the watch first. The second hand jerked forward, still alive then, in its own way. I traced the ridge of the cracked strap with my thumb and set it gently beside me. I didn't cry. Instead, I reached for the sweater. It was softer than I remembered, though a bit dusty. I gathered it up, stood, and walked it to the kitchen sink. A bowl of warm water, a splash of soap, and my hands. I scrubbed it slowly, methodically, the way I used to when the girls were small, when laundry was love. When I finished, I rolled it in a towel and pressed out the water, set it to dry on the line behind the house. The air was crisp, clean. It would dry by morning. That night, I sat in the living room with the box again. I laid each book on the coffee table, stacked by subject: history, architecture, a few thin poetry volumes he'd picked up over the years. The pen, a brass one with a fine nib, still had ink. I tested it on an envelope, smooth as always. I set it aside. Then I stared at the emptying box. And again I thought of what Adam said. "We'll figure it out later, with what's left of you too." The words weren't even angry. They were casual, offhand, dismissive in the way that reveals what someone's always believed but never said aloud. It wasn't about the things. It never had been. It was about power, ownership, territory. They wanted the box not because it contained something they loved, but because it symbolized control. The way people in suits argue over antique clocks they never wound, or over paintings they never noticed until an estate agent reminded them of the auction value. I sat with that idea for a long time, and then I did something quiet, small, but irreversible. I took the box, still half full, and placed it in the trunk of my car. The next morning, just as the sun cracked over the roofs, I drove. I didn't have a destination, not at first. I let the roads decide. I passed the park where Richard once tried to jog and gave up halfway through to buy us snow cones, the library where we spent rainy Saturdays, the old hardware store where he always said the screws were better than the ones at the chain store. And then, by instinct more than intention, I pulled into a quiet lot behind St. Luke's shelter. I had passed it a dozen times, a small brick building with a white cross on the sign, half concealed by trees. It always looked like it didn't want to be noticed. Inside, the receptionist, a tall man with kind eyes and tired shoulders, greeted me without fuss. "I have something," I said. He looked at the box. "Clothes?" "Just one. A sweater." He nodded and led me to a back room where donations were sorted. I opened the box, pulled the sweater from the towel where it had finished drying. I hesitated, one last time, but not from doubt, from recognition. This sweater had felt his warmth, had heard his laughter, had been wrapped around him on cold mornings when we stood by the back door, waiting for the kettle to whistle. But it wasn't meant to sit in a box, not anymore. A volunteer, a man perhaps Richard's age, perhaps a little older, noticed. "Can I?" he asked. I nodded. He pulled the sweater on over his flannel shirt. It fit, a little loose, comfortable. He looked down at himself and smiled, rubbing the fabric with both hands like he was trying to remember something. Warm, he said, like someone remembers me. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I left the shelter with empty hands, but lighter, and something shifted in me then. Not a plan, not yet, but a certainty. If they wanted to reduce him to pieces and probate, then I would scatter him instead. I would put his memory where no one could take it, where no claim could reach. And that box, that damned box, would not be their trophy. It would be the beginning of my reply. That night, I didn't turn on the lights in the house. The street lamps cast long, skeletal shadows across the floorboards as I sat by the front window. I hadn't drawn the curtains. I liked the way the moonlight turned the living room pale blue, like it had been washed in memory. The house was quiet, but not silent, the kind of hush that only comes when someone is missing. I could still hear the soft creak of the water heater in the basement, the hum of the fridge, the occasional groan of wood settling in the beams. But there was a hollowness, too, a space that Richard used to fill without effort. I had left the shelter earlier that day with my hands free and my heart strangely steady. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt precise, like something inside me had clicked into alignment. The box was gone, the sweater was gone, and with it, the first piece of him had been placed into a world that could use it, instead of locked away like a relic. I sat by the window for hours, my legs tucked beneath me, my fingers curled around a chipped mug of chamomile tea that had long since gone cold. On the coffee table sat the pen and the books. I hadn't touched them since the night before, but my eyes weren't on the table. They were on the dark glass of the window, watching my own reflection blur in the faint tremble of wind against the pane. My mind kept circling back to Adam's words. We'll figure it out later, with what's left of you, too. It had been 2 days since that moment, and the sharpness of it hadn't dulled. But it wasn't like a knife anymore. It was something colder, smoother, a kind of steel in my spine. He had said it without heat, no accusation, no drama. That's what made it so brutal. It wasn't a threat. It was a dismissal, an expectation, a certainty that I would disappear quietly, that I would surrender the remnants of the life I had built with his father, just like I was expected to surrender my place in it. It wasn't just that they didn't want the things. They didn't want me. They had always viewed me as temporary, even after 17 years. That night, I didn't sleep. I moved from the window to the bookshelf in the hallway, the narrow one Richard built the winter we had our first snowstorm together. He'd measured each shelf by hand. It had a slight lean to the left, and he refused to fix it because, as he said, even books need personality. I ran my fingers across the spines. I could almost hear his voice, not his final voice, frail and halting, but the one from the middle years, the one that read aloud paragraphs from essays he loved, chuckling at the way some authors wrap their arguments like origami. I pulled out a small hardcover, Cities and Memory. He had marked it with a yellow ticket stub from a jazz show we saw in New Orleans. I opened it to the page where the stub had sat for years. In the margin, Richard had underlined a single line. We remember not only what was, but what we hoped it might become. I closed the book. Somewhere past 3 a.m., I stepped outside. The air was sharp, slicing through my sweater. I stood on the porch and looked up. The stars were visible, faint but insistent. I thought of the man from the shelter, his hands smoothing down the sleeves of Richard's sweater, the way he'd said, like someone remembers me. Maybe memory wasn't what we kept. Maybe it was what we passed on. I went back inside and sat at the dining table, facing the remaining contents of the box, the watch, the pen, the stack of annotated books, all reminders of who Richard had been, not just to me, but to the world. That's when the thought came, clear as if spoken. What if we don't leave anything? Not for them, but for him. Not a legacy etched in bronze. Not a corner in a house he never felt welcome in, but something else, something alive, unclaimed, freely given. I reached for a legal pad from the kitchen drawer. Richard had kept them stacked in a neat pile. I flipped to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote one word in slow, careful cursive: list. Underneath it, I wrote, pen, fine student in need jazz records, neighbor with old vinyl player books, city college library watch, gift to someone who needs time, not a timepiece. I sat back. I looked at it. There was peace in the plan, not vindictiveness, not cruelty, just reclamation. The sun wanted to divide Richard's life like pieces of a pie. I would dissolve it instead. Dissolve it into hands and homes and hearts that would hold it. It would be gone and everywhere. A memory scattered, a life unclaimed. And by morning, I would begin again. The next day, after a shallow, fractured sleep, I woke just before dawn. The sky was beginning to lighten, that pale silver just before sunrise, when the world hasn't decided what kind of day it will be. I padded down the hallway barefoot, still in Richard's old t-shirt. It swallowed me, faded navy with a fraying collar and the name of a jazz bar in St. Louis we'd visited on our second anniversary. I opened the curtains slowly. No need for haste. The house, like me, had quieted into itself. I made coffee the way Richard liked it, dark, strong, no sugar, and carried it to the kitchen table. The legal pad from the night before still sat there, open to my small, deliberate list. Pen, jazz records, books, watch, one question mark, and 100 memories starting to press against the surface. I didn't start by moving things. I started by remembering. Richard had been more than the sum of his things. That was the core of it. And yet, his things held his habits, his laughter, his ways of moving through the world. I pulled the stack of books toward me, one at a time, and opened them. Not to give them away yet, but to see what he had touched, to listen for him in the margins, to hear his breath again between the lines. In a worn volume of Baldwin essays, I found a single grocery list written on a folded piece of receipt paper: carrots, lentils, olive oil, cumin, dark chocolate. His handwriting was neat but softened with time, like someone who knew the point wasn't to impress, but to remember. I held the list up to the light and smiled. That was Richard. He used to cook on Sunday evenings. Not because he had to, I could cook just fine, but because he loved it. He said there was something holy in it. The chopping, the layering, the way spice transformed the ordinary. His son never sat with us on those nights. Too busy, too far. But our neighbors often did. I remembered one time, maybe 10 years ago, when our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Abrams, had a stroke and came back home from the hospital. Richard had made her a pot of his 3-hour lentil stew, packed it in jars, and left it on her doorstep with a small note. Eat slowly. It's the only way it works. She called the next morning in tears. It wasn't about the food. It never is. As I sat at the table, I realized something that made my throat tighten. Adam had never seen those parts of his father, not because he was incapable, but because he never looked. He saw a resume, a bank account, a man who'd built bridges and property lines, not the man who once spent an entire weekend reorganizing my spice rack by country of origin for efficiency and poetry. He didn't see Richard wiping flour off his nose with the back of his hand, or leaning in close to the radio when a Coltrane solo started. But I did, and that mattered, because remembering isn't just nostalgia, it's resistance. It's saying, I was there, I knew him as he was. That morning, I pulled out an old notebook and began writing. Not a memoir, not a eulogy, just small vignettes, memories in their raw, unvarnished form. The way he stood when brushing his teeth, leaning slightly to the left. The joke he made every New Year's Eve about his resolutions already dissolving in champagne. His quiet, reverent habit of putting the record needle down like it was a sacred act. Each moment came with its own weight and warmth, and as I wrote, I thought these were the pieces I would protect, not the watch or the pen, though they had their place, but the man inside them, the gestures, the routines, the small laugh that started in his chest and rolled upward. I flipped to a new page. At the top, I wrote, "The things they'll never know." And below that, I began a new list. He hated cucumbers, but ate them in public to be polite. He once cried watching an old man fix a bike for his grandson. He sang in the shower, always Sinatra, always off key, and on and on. By mid-morning, the house felt different, not lighter, but clearer. I placed the notebook beside the legal pad. Two kinds of maps, one for giving, one for remembering. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves skittered across the porch like small, urgent messengers. I stood, stretched, and looked out at the neighbor's house. Mrs. Abrams was sitting on her porch in a blanket, a record player humming beside her. She still played jazz. Vinyl only. I smiled. I knew where the records would go, not as donation, as recognition. The past doesn't belong in glass cases. It belongs in breath and music and motion, and I would keep moving. I woke at dawn. No alarm, no birdsong, just that soft internal nudge that comes when sleep has run its course and your thoughts are ready to take over. I pulled on a sweater, tied my hair back, and walked barefoot to the kitchen. The floor was cool, grounding. The legal pad still sat on the table, right where I left it. My handwriting looked calm, firm. It didn't tremble like it had after the funeral. I boiled water, made a mug of tea, and sat down. Time to begin. I picked up the pen first. It was heavier than it looked, brass, with a little chip in the barrel. Richard had used it daily. It was the only thing he'd ever been picky about. Once, when a cashier tried to hand him a ballpoint, he smiled gently and said, "Forgive me, I'm old-fashioned about tools." He wrote letters with it. To me, to the utility company, to his best friend after a surgery. He wrote thoughts that didn't need answers. I clicked the pen and wrote a single word on the back of a receipt. Begin. Then I wrapped it in a piece of linen and placed it in my purse. At the community college, there's a bulletin board with scholarships and notices. I left the pen in a small padded envelope at the front desk with a note that read, "For a student of language, may you write something true." I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. Next were the books. They took 2 trips. I packed them neatly into reusable canvas bags. No boxes, no more cardboard, no more things to be sorted. The library at the college has a small corner for donations. The woman behind the counter glanced at the spines, nodded, and ran her finger across one of Richard's annotations. She didn't ask questions. "Some of these haven't been printed in years," she said softly. "Thank you." I smiled but didn't speak. My hands ached a little as I walked back to the car. But it was a clean ache, not the kind that comes from holding on too long. The kind that comes from release. Later that evening, I took out the jazz records, vinyl, some of it scratched, all of it loved. I stacked them on the kitchen table and flipped through them slowly. Billy, Miles, Coltrane, Ella, the soundtrack of Sunday mornings and rainy nights. Our neighbor, Mrs. Abrams, had a small record player. She always played it loud enough for the block to hear, but never enough to be rude. Once, Richard had waved at her across the street when she played one of his favorites. She had saluted him with her coffee mug. I walked over just after sunset. The sky was deepening to navy. She answered the door still in her housecoat, curlers pinned. "Carol?" she said, surprised. "Everything okay?" "I brought you something," I said. She stepped aside. I placed the stack of records on her dining table, gently. She blinked at them, touched a sleeve. I haven't heard this one in years, she whispered. He used to hum this one when he walked by. I nodded. We didn't say anything else. As I turned to leave, I heard the first notes of a saxophone drift into the air behind me. And then, finally, the watch. I had almost forgotten it, tucked at the bottom of the bag. It was old. The leather strap had cracked along the edges. It didn't tick anymore, but it felt like something that could still hold time in a different way. I kept it until the right person came along. I didn't know who it would be, but I knew I'd recognize them. And I did, a week later, on a bench by the bus stop. A man, maybe 40, holding a small girl's hand. His clothes were work-worn, his boots mud-stained. She was showing him her drawings. He listened with his full face, the way Richard used to. I sat beside them and pulled the watch from my coat pocket. "Excuse me," I said. "This belonged to someone who noticed the small things. I think he would have liked you to have it." He looked stunned. I placed it in his palm, nodded, and walked away. I never turned around. That night, the legal pad on my table had a new list. A short one. Underneath it, I wrote, "What's left? Nothing in my hands, but more in the world." I exhaled. The box was gone, but he was everywhere, and I was just getting started. In the days that followed, I moved with intention. I didn't rush. I didn't delay. I simply followed the list, and then the list expanded on its own. Like Richard's favorite stew, it grew richer the longer it simmered. I started with the City College Library. The books, annotated, dog-eared, some out of print, were bundled in canvas. I brought them just before noon on a Tuesday, when the library was quiet, the way he liked it. The woman at the desk was different this time, younger, with short hair dyed the color of copper pennies. She looked over the titles with a kind of reverence. "These were his?" she asked. I nodded. She placed them gently on a cart, like they were something more than paper and ink. "Some of these will go on display," she said. "We have a table for voices that shaped thinking. We rotate it every month." I didn't expect that, but I didn't stop it either. "Thank you," I said, and meant it. Next came the pen. I had wrapped it carefully, tied in a cloth napkin from our old Sunday table set. I left it at the language department with a sealed note. Inside, I wrote only this: "To someone who still writes by hand, carry something that has known truth. No name, no address, just intention." The campus was breezy that day, full of motion. I watched students cross the quad, phones out, earbuds in, heads down. But now and then, someone paused, looked up at the sky, laughed, adjusted the strap of a too-heavy backpack. I wondered if that's who the pen would find. Someone still noticing. The jazz records had already found their new home with Mrs. Abrams, but I returned the next evening just to hear them. She had them on rotation, Armstrong that night, and the windows of her home glowed amber, as if warmed by sound. She waved to me without stopping the record. No words were needed. I walked home in silence, the music fading behind me, like memory stepping back. The last thing on the list was the watch. It had taken me time to decide. Time, ironic maybe, for a watch. But not this one. This wasn't about measuring seconds. It was about rhythm, about presence. Richard never used it to hurry, only to check that he had more time to linger. I carried it with me everywhere for a week, in my pocket, in my palm. I held it when I stood in line, when I sat at traffic lights, when I paused at a crosswalk. I thought it would be hard to part with, but it wasn't. Not when I met the boy on the train. He couldn't have been more than 19. Nervous, twisting the edge of a worn backpack. He was headed to an interview. I knew without asking. He was mouthing something under his breath. Maybe a pitch, maybe a prayer. When we reached the downtown station, I tapped him gently. "This was my husband's," I said. "He believed in showing up. Take it. For luck, or time, or both." He looked stunned, almost afraid. "It doesn't work," I added, smiling. "But it still counts." He took it like it was glass, and that was enough. When I returned home, the house felt emptied, but not vacant. The corners no longer held objects. They held air, possibility, breath. I sat at the table where the legal pad used to be and opened the notebook instead, the one with the memories. I added another page. He used to say the right things at the wrong times, and somehow it worked. He hated the sound of Velcro. He once stopped a meeting to watch a hawk land outside the window. The stories would outlast the items. That was the point. And in the quiet hum of the house, I realized something. They would come looking soon, but there would be nothing left to take. It was nearly 2 months after Richard's funeral when Adam called. I was in the garden, kneeling by the flower beds, coaxing new growth from soil that had grown dry with neglect. The phone buzzed on the porch table. I wiped my hands on a towel before answering. His name lit the screen like an aftershock. "Hello?" I said, keeping my voice even. "Carol." A pause. No warmth. "We've been going through some of Dad's paperwork." We, not I. Always the collective. His wife, his lawyer, whoever else stood behind that voice. "We're going to set up a memorial area in the living room, a corner with his things, some photos, the watch, his pen, a few of the books." I waited. He hadn't asked anything yet, just declared. "We assume you have those. Could you gather them? We'll come by next week to pick them up." Assume, pick up, like a dry cleaning errand, like the remains of a party they didn't attend. I exhaled slowly. The air smelled of rosemary and something faintly metallic, a reminder I still wore Richard's old garden gloves. "They're gone," I said. Silence. "What do you mean?" His voice tightened. "I gave them away." "To who?" "To people who needed them, or who understood what they were." The pause stretched. "You had no right." That was it. No fury, no mourning. Just that crisp line, the final defense of those who never knew how to feel. Legality. "I had every right," I said. "I lived with him. I knew him. You want a memorial corner. He deserves a life that continues." I could hear his breathing, shallow and sharp. "That's not your decision." I stepped into the shade of the porch. My shadow fell across the table. "You had 17 years to ask about his decisions. You used 3 of them." He hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't even sit down. I took off the gloves, folded them neatly, and returned to the garden. It was late afternoon by the time I stopped. The sun had dipped low, casting long amber streaks across the lawn, the kind of light that makes everything feel older, but not necessarily sad. That night, I pulled the notebook close and wrote a new entry. He never liked corners, always rearranged furniture to open the room. The next morning, a letter arrived. It came by courier, not post. A man in a gray uniform handed it to me with a slight nod, then turned without a word. The return address belonged to a law office. Inside was a single request, wrapped in formality. "We require documentation to confirm the location or disposition of items of value previously in your possession." No greeting, no name, just a signature at the bottom from someone who had never met my husband. I placed the letter on the dining table. I didn't pace. I didn't call anyone. I sat with it. Then I turned it over and wrote my response on the blank side in my own handwriting, slow and steady. He wasn't things. He was a man. Everything you're looking for is already living in other people. I folded it, placed it in the envelope, and wrote only 2 words on the front. "Return to sender." Then I walked it to the mailbox and let the flag stand upright like a small red declaration. That evening, I sat at the window. The garden was dark now, but the memory of Richard kneeling beside the thyme, muttering about soil density and cloud cover, drifted easily into the room. Let them build a corner. Let them frame a picture, set up a chair, pretend to remember. I had given him something better, a scattering into the world. No corner could contain him, and no paper could ever reclaim what had already taken root. A week passed, the letter had gone out. I received no reply, no email, no call, not even a knock. The silence was louder than any confrontation could have been. Then, out of nowhere, came another envelope. This one came by registered mail, a stamped seal on the corner. Inside, typed lines, dense and deliberate. Please confirm by written declaration the current possession or disposition of any personal items formerly belonging to the deceased. The estate's representatives require this information for probate review. It was couched in legal terms, designed to sound routine, but I could feel the teeth behind it. The assumption lingered between the lines that I was holding something back, that I could be made to surrender, that I had something they could still seize. I folded the letter once and placed it on the table beside the first. For a moment, I simply stared at the two of them. Documents of control, paper voices, trying to reduce a man's memory into inventory. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I walked to Richard's desk. It had sat untouched for weeks now, a small, sturdy piece he'd built himself from reclaimed wood. Inside the drawer was a box of his old stationery, cream-colored sheets, faintly textured. I chose one. I sat down, uncapped a fountain pen, and wrote in long, deliberate strokes. To whom it may concern, there is no inventory. There are no heirlooms to list, no objects stored or hidden. Nothing remains to be divided or claimed. The man you are referencing lived a life. He cooked on Sundays. He read Baldwin in the evenings. He donated quietly. He laughed loudly. He never once treated a person as a possession. You are requesting proof of value. Here it is. Everything he was now lives in strangers, in borrowed jackets, in gifted pens, in music that still plays behind someone's open window. I suggest you go out and listen. Sincerely, Carol White. I folded the letter. No envelope this time. I placed it in the same courier sleeve they'd used. Let it feel familiar in their hands. 2 days later, I checked the tracking. It had been signed for, received. And that was that. No reply ever came. But a week after that, something else arrived, not by mail, not by law. It came through the website of the local community archive, where I'd anonymously posted audio clips I'd started compiling. Interviews with neighbors, with Richard's colleagues, with the man from the shelter who now wore his sweater. I'd titled the project quietly, Echoes of a Life. It was public, unbranded, no passwords, no protection, just stories waiting to be heard. And under one of the clips, a scratchy recording of Richard humming while stirring soup, there was a comment. This was not your right. The name was Adams. I stared at the words for a moment, my fingers resting on the keyboard. The screen glowed faintly in the dim room. Outside, the trees shifted in a warm evening wind. For the first time, I hovered over the reply box, but I didn't type. I didn't need to. Because 2 comments below his, someone else had already answered, "Have you ever been around when he was laughing just drinking coffee?" And that was enough. I turned off the screen, and beside it, on the shelf, I placed a small, empty wooden box. Not to store anything, but to remind myself there was nothing left for them. It was the beginning of March when I finally opened the storage closet at the back of the house. Richard always called it the archive, half mocking, half serious, as if our life had been a long series of chapters needing careful shelving. I stood there for a long while before stepping inside. The air was cool, dry. A single bulb swung above, casting a faint circle of light on the boxes we had packed away over 17 years. Holiday decorations, travel guides, old cassette tapes, spare bulbs and screws, and memory, more of it than I had expected. I sat cross-legged on the floor with a box labeled Voice Recordings. Inside were small microcassettes, some labeled, others blank. Richard had a habit of recording stray thoughts when he walked alone. He said it helped him remember ideas before they dissolved. I carried the box to the kitchen and dusted off the old handheld player. The battery compartment was corroded, but the plug still worked. I inserted a tape and pressed play. The hiss of time. Then, his voice. Note to self, find out if time can survive frost. Then, nothing for a few seconds. Also, remember to ask Carol if she still hates the red mug. I smiled. I had hated that mug. It was chipped and oddly shaped, but he refused to throw it away, called it faithful. I spent the next 3 weeks listening, not all at once, just a little each morning. One tape over tea, one after watering the plants. His voice never faltered. Even in those early days when his breath had already grown thin, he spoke clearly, intentionally. It gave me an idea. I began collecting stories. I visited neighbors. I emailed old colleagues. I found people who had known him in fragments. The man at the record store, a retired professor who used to ride the train with him, a barista from a cafe he stopped at every Tuesday morning. I asked each the same thing. Tell me a moment you remember. Just one. Some sent recordings, others wrote emails. A few came by in person. They brought laughter, hesitations, and sometimes tears, but always honesty. I didn't filter anything. I just compiled. I took the recordings, both his and theirs, and started uploading them to a free public archive online. I didn't add photos, no descriptions, just first names and dates. Titles like Mason, Tuesday Coffee Conversations, Terry, the map on his wall, Unknown, watching rain from the bus. There was no fanfare, no announcement, just presence. I called it Echoes of a Life. In a world so eager to package a man into an estate folder, this was my rebellion. Not against Adam or lawyers or silence, but against forgetting. The house grew quieter as I worked, but not in a way that felt lonely. It was the quiet of concentration, of something purposeful. The way Richard used to fall silent when folding laundry, believing it deserved attention. One night, while uploading a story titled, Ruth, He Knew When to Be Quiet, I paused. I realized I wasn't grieving anymore. I was preserving. No corner in Adam's house could hold this, and it didn't need to. It belonged to the wind outside someone's window, to the man in the shelter, to the student writing late into the night. Richard was not in the things I had given away. He was in what they continued. Spring arrived in quiet pulses, not a dramatic shift, but a gradual loosening of winter's grip. The trees outside the house grew fuller, greener. The garden softened with new color. I spent mornings sitting on the porch steps, wrapped in a shawl, watching the neighborhood wake up. The website was growing, not rapidly, not loudly, but steadily. Each week, a new story found its way in. I didn't always know the names. Some came with only initials or vague return addresses. A few people sent audio of their own, remembering Richard in ways I never saw. He once helped me change a flat in the middle of nowhere. He gave me a job reference. I didn't even ask. He just did it. He used to whistle when the light turned green. It was a kind of mosaic, scattered, uneven, beautiful in its imperfections. And then, one night, I received a message request. It was from Adam. No subject line, Just a short message. I listened to some of it. I didn't know most of it. I don't think he ever told me. Or maybe I didn't ask. There was a long pause between sentences, not in the text, but in what I imagined behind it. Then, I still don't agree with what you did, but I understand more now. No apology, no attempt to reclaim, just a shift in posture, a quiet bend in the branch. I didn't respond. Instead, I closed the laptop and stood up. The room was dark except for the glow of the desk lamp. I turned it off, and on the shelf beside me sat the wooden box, still empty. But now I understood what it held. It wasn't a void, it was a space, a cleared place where grief had once lived, a place no longer occupied by what was taken, but by what had been given. I walked through the house slowly that night. No rush. My hand touched the back of the armchair he always leaned into, the frame above the fireplace where one of his maps used to hang. I didn't feel the sting anymore. I felt air, openness, like something had been lifted, not erased. When I reached the kitchen, I turned on the kettle, the same one we'd used for 17 years. Steam rose. I poured the water into a cup and sat at the table, alone, but not lonely. He was everywhere now. In the laughter 2 streets down when the jazz played through someone's open window, in the quiet discipline of a student writing by lamplight, in the slow, careful pause before someone gives away something meaningful. He was not in a corner. He was not a category. And I was not what was left. I was what remained.